We want to thank everyone for taking some time out of your morning to talk about a very vital issue in our community, and that's racial inequity. I'm Judy Maggio. I'm with KLRU's Decibel, and I'm honored as always to lead these community conversations. And before we get started, I want to introduce Toya Bell, past president of the Leadership Austin Board of Directors.
Thank you so much for being here. My name is Toya Bell, as Judy mentioned, and the Board of Leadership Austin, our staff, all the alumni, we're just so thrilled that you're here today, especially for this particular program. Over a year ago, Leadership Austin and our Austin community engaged in a journey of discovery and self-reflection about racial inequity in our community. Leadership Austin, our alumni, played a big role in a lot of the work that you'll be hearing about today. Many of our board members, leaders, alumni served on the task force. Many of them chaired various subcommittees. Many of us are working on the implementation plans that you'll be hearing about based on the recommendations that were made by the task force. So we're all in this together with each of you. We hope that those of you who haven't had a chance to take the Beyond Diversity program will do so. If you haven't had a chance to read the report, that you'll do that as well. One of the things that we like to stress at this breakfast is that there are three main takeaways. First, that you come prepared to be informed, to learn about something new, or to deepen your perspective and understanding about an issue in our community. Secondly, that you'll appreciate the perspectives that you hear and realize that there are many perspectives that are different than your own. But by learning from those perspectives, you may improve your understanding of a particular issue. And then finally, that you will act, that there'll be a call to action. You'll go back into the community and your community work, your professional lives, your personal lives, and you'll make changes that are conscientious and deliberate based upon the information, the perspectives that you hear today. At Leadership Austin, as I mentioned, we've been in this with you together in this journey. Over the past couple of years, we have altered our curriculum to ensure that we spend more time on diversity and inclusion. If you look at our website, you'll see that our board is one of the most diverse boards, nonprofit boards in Austin. And it's been that way for several years, and that's a conscientious and very deliberate effort to ensure that every voice is represented at the table through race, ethnicity, culture, socioeconomic background, professional background. We've structured our meetings to allow more discussion time so that everyone's voice can be heard as we're making strategic decisions about the future of the organization. And then with regard to the task force recommendations, many of us went through that program at the invitation of Mayor Adler and his team. And having that experience really changed our perspectives. We realized that we wanted to do something to enrich the Leadership Austin alumni community by offering the Beyond Diversity program, but we also realized it was bigger than that. It's about our entire community, and the task force recommendation that everyone go through that program. So we're really excited that, thanks to the support of many of you, we were able to provide 12 programs thus far with over 1,000 individuals in Austin going through that comprehensive program. And that program is now embedded in the Essential program, so all individuals in the Essential program spend 2 days in Beyond Diversity. So again, thank you for being here. Thank you for being on this journey with us. We are in this together for a better Austin. Thank you.
Well said, Toya. Thank you. And that Beyond Diversity training, for those of you who have experienced as I have, it's truly life-altering. It's an amazing, inspiring, thought-provoking experience. Our goal at Decibel, and I'm talking about KLRU's News and Public Affairs Department, is to cover local issues that truly matter. And that's why this partnership with Leadership Austin has made so much sense for us, because we're often covering the very same topics and issues. We have a few quick reminders. We are live streaming right now on our Facebook page. If you want to share with folks who can't make it downtown to be part of these conversations live, the address on Facebook is Decibel ATX. If you want to turn around and say hello and welcome to everybody watching online this morning. Don't do anything you wouldn't want your mom seeing you do. Thanks for those of you tuning in and watching from home this morning. As is tradition with our Leadership Boston Engage Breakfast, we invite you to engage by texting in questions. The instructions are right there on the big screen for you. We want to introduce Courtney Bailey at the end of our table here. She is Leadership Boston's Director of Issues and Engagement, and she will really be your voice today. She'll be looking at the questions people are posing and fielding those questions to our panel up here today. So we're talking about institutional racism, and I want to give a little framework before we start our discussion. Back in June 2017, we hosted here an Engage Breakfast as part of the release of the Mayor's Task Force report on institutional racism and system inequities. So we're about a year and a half into that work right now in our community. We thought it would be a great time to gather everyone once again and really get an update on where we are in making some of these recommendations a reality and where work really still needs to be done. Before we jump into the conversation, I want to first talk about a common definition. When we talk about institutional racism, we are referring to policies and practices across institutions and systems that single out or harm persons of color. Institutional racism, as we all know, exists within our government, our schools, our business structures, criminal justice, etc. Now, institutional racism should not be confused with individual racism. That focuses on individual behaviors. We all need to confront our own biases. We can't create, though, racial equity without confronting the institutions and the systems that have deeply rooted histories around wealth, power, and privilege of those who develop and maintain those institutions and systems. So to address institutional racism and systems inequities, we have to intentionally kind of create vocabulary, a common language, and goals around that very issue. Mayor Adler collaborated with community leaders to form this task force to explore institutions and systems to kind of address Austin's history. And we all know about this long history of racial inequities in our community. The task force recommended and produced a report in the spring of 2017. It included 250 recommendations. 5 focus areas we're going to be talking about more today: criminal justice and civil justice, education, health, finance, banking and industry, real estate, and housing. And for those of you who got your reminder for today's breakfast, there should be a link to the entire report in that email. Let's get started. We want to introduce our panel. We're going to keep it brief because everyone knows the rock stars up here today. Mayor Steve Adler. Mayor Adler is our first mayor to serve under the 10-1 City Council. He was just sworn in this week to his 2nd term, and we want to thank you for serving our community for another 4 years. Dr. Colette Pierce Burnette. Dr. Burnette is the first female president of Houston-Tillotson University, and of course we all know that that's Austin's only historically black college and university, and she has really taken a deep dive on so many great issues and become involved in our community in great ways since she's been here. How long have you been here now? 4 years?
3.5.
3.5 years. Dr. Paul Cruz is the superintendent of the Austin Independent School District, has a lot of things on his plate right now, and he serves more than 80,000 students. So we sure appreciate you all giving us your time this morning, because I know you have a hectic schedule. Before we talk about the actual recommendations, I really want to ask a question of all 3 of you from the heart. Why have you made racial inequities in this task force a priority for your time and your energies? Why is this issue so close to you? I'm going to start down on the end with our 2 task force chairs. Dr. Cruz, could you get started with that?
Okay, absolutely. I believe in it because I believe that we come from a point of strength, and I think there's strength in diversity. I think that's important, that we focus on what people bring to the table and not have a deficit approach. I think that's what is probably most troubling when we talk about institutional racism and inequities, is that we always look at things as, in those situations, as a deficit. And that's a wrong perspective. It should be an additive approach. What do individuals bring to the table that may be different from what I think, but let's see what they bring to the table. And let's look at that as something that is strong, that is powerful, and will make me better. And so we come from a place of strength. That's why this is so passionate for me. That's why urban education has been so passionate for me, because it's about making sure that we're providing the best opportunities for our students, but looking at them from a point of strength, of power, and of voice, and giving them that voice. That's what drives me into this very powerful work.
Well, good morning, everyone. I have committed my personal and my professional life to this work. Growing up, clearly, I'm African American. I'm good at it. I like it. Unapologetically Black. Being in higher education, I don't want my students to experience what I experienced growing up as an African American female, striving to realize the American dream. So that is my why. And when you look at your own life in hindsight, you realize what you should do in your adult life. So I came to realize that as a nation in the 60s, which I grew up in the 60s, we reached equality, but we didn't reach equity. And so I said to myself, what can I do in my sphere of influence? So I transferred my career into higher education, specifically to work at a historically Black college, because I believe so strongly that education is the great equalizer. So when Mayor Adler asked me to serve as the co-chair, my first reaction was to say no, because my job is too consuming. But as I processed it, I didn't want to be one of those persons that sat on the sidelines to talk about race challenges that we have in our nation, but not actually be doing something in my own sphere of influence. So that's my why.
I love what you said about we reached equality, but we didn't reach equity. Well said. Mayor Adler, why did you make this such a big priority when you took office, from your heart?
In a lot of ways, I think it is the priority. There are so many things that are working so well in our community. We have such advantages over almost every other city every other city in the country, with so many things that are going right. But that really does put in relief what it is that's not going right in our community. And when you look at the things that are not going right, the things that are our Achilles heel, the things that are holding us back, the things that really are the biggest threats to us being able to preserve what it is that's special about this place, it comes back to this issue. And it's a tough issue, and it is a pervasive issue, and it is something that impacts almost everything that happens in the city and everything that it is everywhere. And we're not going to actually be able to do something about it until there's that kind of an understanding. You know, what really gave rise to this particular effort was David Joseph, who in 2016 was running down a street in Austin butt naked and ended up getting shot and killed by a police officer. And there were calls in the community to do something. We had in our practice was to have a community conversation at that point. We had done it repeatedly. We were good at that. But at some point you begin to say something has to happen that is more and different from that. Well, then what is that? And to look at any particular officer or any particular situation or any particular set of facts is to lose what it is that was really at the base of that kind of thing. So we started talking about that in that way. And that's what gave rise to this task force, which was to take a look at race and the institutional issues, but not just in criminal justice, but to take a look at it in access to capital. Because we're not going to really impact what happened on that street until we solve access to capital issues. And quite frankly, you're not going to solve the access to capital issues until you're actually able to address that issue as it impacts housing or healthcare delivery. You're not, because all those things are tied together, and there is no solution to any one of those that is not involving the solution to all of those. And when you look at it that way, then the challenge is exactly the same in each of those areas. And that's the conversation that this community has to have. It is a conversation that is hard to have, because when we wanted to have a task force on institutional racism, which just want to thank Leadership Austin for really leaning into this. It's been incredible. But we wanted to have the conversation, and I know that some of the people in the room have heard me say this. The number of people that contacted me immediately to say, this is such an incredibly good thing, about time, wonderful thing to do. Can you call it something other than institutional racism? Which is why we have to hold this and why we can't call it anything else.
I'm going to call this the meat and potatoes part of the program, because I want to kind of talk about the basics. You know, people have been on the front lines dealing with, you know, fighting for change for decades when it comes to racial inequities in our community. What have we learned by doing this work thus far? What have we learned? Since this report was released 18 months ago, where are we a year and a half down the road? Who wants to start with that one? And feel free to everybody chime in on this one, because I think this is one of those things where we can do kind of a back and forth discussion. But since this report came out, in that year and a half, where are we now? What have we learned?
All right. Either one. We're almost dressed like we're going to the prom, right? We even chose the right colors today. We do this all the time now. But
Did you get your
like
boutonniere?
We did. I know. I'm sending the corsage later, and we got to take a prom picture when we're matching. But because of what Colette talked about in her background and her experiences, and I can relate to those experiences as well, with the mayor talking about racism and like, can you call it something else? We were just concerned of how it was going to be received, because those are very strong words, and people have a very strong reaction, not even a response sometimes. It's a very quick reaction to it. And what I found in this experience is that people were really ready to talk about it. People really wanted to come to the table. They volunteered of their own time. They spent numerous hours coming together to see what's happening, what can we do about it, and shaping some policy decisions. So for me, it's maybe what I already knew about Austin, having been here for a while, but it just reaffirmed and enforced my belief in Austin, the Austin community, about building on what is great about us, understanding what we need to change around institutional racism, and facing that head on. But the number of people who have come to be a part of this process, to also go through training, through Beyond Diversity training, and even just this morning, I saw some of my we're like band parents, right, from one of our high schools, right, and talked about that experience and how different that was. I think had we not had this opportunity, maybe individuals would not have had the opportunity to be self-reflective. But to me, it's been the acceptance, the awareness, and the reaffirmation of how people here in Austin really want to work together to address racial inequities.
And to add to what Paul said, it takes courage to talk about race. I mean, I really commend Mayor Adler for calling it what it is, because the word racism is a lightning rod word, so people tend to shy away from it. What I've seen happen is people leaning in to have a courageous conversation about race, and that's the beginning, because it really starts in the heart, and we have to change people's hearts in order to address this. That's why we as a nation have done tremendous things when it comes to advancing technology, but we still continue to struggle with this institutional racism and systemic inequities, because it's in people's hearts, and you have to really own that. The one thing I want to add that I've noticed is Austin doesn't want this to be a moment, but instead it wants it to be a movement. And that's why it still has a life and still keeps going. And when you have a movement, you always have to have allies and accomplices. So you have to choose whether you want to be an ally or whether you want to be an accomplice, and that's a difference. And we've gotten some very powerful accomplices in this movement, Leadership Austin being one of them, to take up the mantra to say that we want to actually move this conversation, this training, if you will, forward, and training over 900 people, all sold out sessions, 60% white, 30% of color, males, females, just people across sectors. So that happened from individual citizens wanting to lean in and learn more so that you can have this conversation more comfortably about race. And then even IBM with the design thinking, so that's an industry partner, under the leadership of Nikki Graham to get the bankers involved in it. So we've gotten these accomplices, people that really want to be engaged and doing something in action and not standing on the sidelines. Austin Community Foundation, I could go on and on and on talking about very well-known, if you will, not normal people to be engaged in this conversation beyond community activists. So that's been a very powerful movement, and that tells me that this is more than a moment in Austin's history, it's actually a movement.
What have we learned, Mayor?
So, how many people in the room have attended the Beyond Diversity or Courageous Conversations training? If you haven't raised your hand, I'd note that. Of the people that raised your hand, how many people in that group did not learn something new about themselves or about the issue? If you didn't attend it, you need to. And I don't say that lightly. I say that you need to do it. I think that what has happened in the last year and a half is we have a growing cohort of people in our community that recognize that this is an issue that while they may have thought they understood really well, they did not understand it well enough to be able to be the change agent in a community that's necessary for us to really be able to change culture and to change hearts. So we have just under 1,000 people that have attended. In a community like Austin, I think we want to be able to reach 1 million people. And while it's certainly not realistic to think that you're going to have 1 million people take 2 days off to be able to do this session, I think the goal of being able to reach people so that everyone in this community knows someone who has, or knows somebody who knows somebody that has, or everybody in this community has some aspect of their life that happens differently because somebody has gone through this training or this awareness so that things are actually changing. So in the last year and a half, what we know is that as soon as the report came out, at about the same time the report came out, Austin, after going through a 2-year process, was issuing its strategic housing plan for the city to adopt. Great work done by great people over a long period of time. And finally, it's worked its way through all the vetting process and comes to the city council. And the only thing that stood between it and getting approved, coincidentally, was the fact that this report was issued at the same time. And everybody who worked on that strategic housing plan read that report and asked if they could pull it back and work on it just a little bit more before they brought it to the city council. The fact that we now have bankers from competing institutions who don't meet because they're competitors, meeting together on the issue of access to capital is real. You know, what we modeled this after was something that Obama had done with policing, and he said, I want a group to go away and not come back with another redefinition of what the challenge is. We know what the challenge is. Come back with really specific things that we can do in a community. And that's happened. And some of the things that are on the list showed up in community efforts, like the People's Plan on displacement, but it also showed up in the more juried conversations with the University of Texas on that same issue. Now we have 250 recommendations, and there's nothing really magic about those other than it focuses people on doing real things. So the effort's continuing with each one of those verticals to now prioritize with the IBM work what can be done, to add to those, to modify those based on additional work. So it's impacting policy, it's impacting practice, and it is increasing its reach out into the community, but it is just a start. You know, I am real pleased to see how many people in this room at a Leadership Austin breakfast like this have actually attended. And I will tell you, I am also surprised by the number of people who did not raise their hands.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the successes, the victories with this task force and recommendations thus far in the past year and a half. What's the hard part? You know, where are we seeing the frustrations? Where are we falling short? Where does the real work need to be done?
That's just it. Now we're at the real work needs to be done. And people get tired. And that's what happens. We talk, and then when it's time for action, we stop talking because it's a heavy lift. So that is the challenge. And that's why I appreciate forums like this, so that we can communicate that it is still an ongoing effort, and we do still need everyday citizens to be engaged and to be involved. We actually have a meeting this week, I believe this Friday, with our working group co-chairs, because now we've synthesized the 250 recommendations down to a few that we can now begin to work on and have an implementation plan. So those that have lived experiences or those that have content knowledge, content experience, we still need people at the table to start really working towards putting our shoulders to the grind, to the mill, if you will, so that we can continue to do the work. So that is the challenge, is to continue to keep people engaged, so that we all say we're too busy, but we actually choose what we want to be engaged in. So it's to continue to keep people engaged and keep people involved, because this is the work of everyday people to do this kind of work. And that's what the steering committee and the working group, they were all volunteers. And the mayor gave us I believe it was 6 months timeline to get the report done, which felt unrealistic, but in hindsight, if we had not had that line in the sand that we had to achieve something by that time, we would still, especially as educators, Paul and I, we love to create camels, just keep talking about it and talking about it and talking about it. So we were forced to actually come up with something, a clear set of recommendations. So now we've synthesized that to prioritize those that we can actually, that are tangible and doable. So we need people to continue to be engaged. That is the challenge. So that we can negate the naysayers that say this was just a moment. Because we still have that where people say, oh, that was just a task force. We keep doing that. So if we keep saying that, that's what happens. But if we actually put action to it, then we can continue to make progress. And the progress is to dismantle. It's not to wave a magic wand and for it to go away. And it takes a lot of work.
Anybody else want to talk about the tough part of this, that where we're falling short right now and where you really want to focus so we can overcome those shortfalls?
Well, I think it's also in what you said earlier, that existed over time, and to change our practice is to change policy, is to change our mindset, and to call it what it is, look at our biases and say, why is it? And then make those changes. It always seems like it's, well, we said it, it should happen. But the minute you do, it's like, well, we didn't say that. And it's, well, can we do this? Well, we didn't say that either. Well, can we change? Well, no, of course not. You can't change that. And all of a sudden, we're back to where we started. And I have great confidence in the way it's been done this time with, and what Colette mentioned and our mayor mentioned. I look out as I see Nikki here and I see Ollie, people who've come from different perspectives and are still teaming together, and it's still literally at the table still to talk about it. I saw our board president, Geronimo Rodriguez, who was here, who has his experiences as well and has firsthand experiences of these biases, the inequities that have existed, and how can we change that in our school systems. I see Lynn Boswell, who's head of our Austin Council of PTAs. You got these strong advocates who understand Austin, who understand how great it is today, but if we don't change some of this thing, it ain't gonna be so great later on. But now's the time to do that. Otherwise, we'll be sitting here thinking 10 years from now, 20 years, we shoulda, coulda, woulda, shoulda. And this has not been that. It's been really about taking that reflection, make that time for reflective, that experience, seeing what has to be changed. And that's, I would also say, is the tougher part. There's not a how-to. There hasn't been something written that said, this is what you gotta do, and you do 1, 2, and it's lockstep. It doesn't work like that. And it's also people. And it's straight up just working with people and having these could be very challenging conversations. I know when we experience them, sometimes people will speak up and talk. Sometimes people just shut down and just will not do it. And we all understand that could even be more harmful to an organization and a community when that conversation just stops. And I think that's what the challenging part is. How do you approach it? What do you do when you get to a really difficult part in that conversation? What do you do at that point? How do you figure out a path forward? What I think is going to be the work for us is to continue with the leadership in the room, and I do commend Leadership Austin for taking it on, because this is what's so powerful, is that you really didn't have to. Nobody, well, maybe the mayor said, I don't know. Colette and I showed up in his office when he called us the next day, when he told me the one day that Rosa, my assistant, told me I was going to be meeting with him. He wanted to meet with him. I went home and told my wife, I said, the mayor wants to meet with me. And she said, what did you do? I said, I don't know.
You got called
I don't
to the
know, but
principal's
are lights
office.
on? I mean, what's going on here? But I think both Colette and I had that experience, because we really didn't know what it was going to be about. But I think the power now is about having people who can make those changes, who really can look at practices and policies and make changes. That's different. It's different, and that's evidence of just the individuals you see around the room.
Judy, I'd like to add just
Sure.
one thing Paul made me think of. The initial challenge was to get like conversation, like language, and we had these C-suite executives, but I really want to acknowledge that this is work that's being built on previous and current courageous activists. So it's to get
Very important.
people, activists, previous and current activists engaged with C-suite executives. And that's powerful, because you get people with lived experiences and people that have power and influence together in a conversation to talk. So that is a challenge, to keep those two groups together so that everybody is continuing to move forward and singing from the same hymnal.
Because I'm sure there's some fatigue on the part of the people who've been on the front lines of this fight for decades. So getting them actually matched up with these corporations, that's a great point. I bet we have some audience questions.
We do. So I want to emphasize the fact that this is called the Mayor's Task Force. And you all have expressed your personal interest in the issues. And unfortunately, sometimes when initiatives take flight, they sometimes lose their momentum because of failure to pass the torch. Have you considered any plans to ensure that this issue remains a top priority for those next in leadership?
The answer to that is yes, and it's called the Mayor's Task Force because that's how it was initiated, and quite frankly, calling it that ensured that more people would show up at the first meeting.
We're chopped meat.
But that is not a recipe or design to actually have the work continue, because it can't happen out of the mayor's office. It only happens if it's something that gets picked up and adopted by the community. Only happens if if this becomes Leadership Austin's conference. But it's not just that, it's the community's work. It only happens if it's Colette's task force. It only happens if it's Paul's task force. It only happens if there's some momentum that actually takes hold and it becomes more pervasive. Quite frankly, that's why I'm sitting here today and appreciative of this organization, because we are at the challenging part. We're at the part where it has to get adopted and work. For me, the challenge is an awareness issue. I can, sorry, I've been accused of that many times and already warned. I think that the most significant challenge that we have is one that is about awareness. I think everybody at some level can very easily say that race and racism is an important thing. And then having known that, then we go about the rest of our lives. But the truth is that there's very few, if any, choices or decisions that I make as mayor in this city or things that I'm involved in where this is not part or should be part of how I perceive the choice that I'm making and how I evaluate that and then test what it is that was my first inclination and to take a look at it. It's having that filter on this issue on everything that I do, and it's not just me. It is everybody in this room, and it's everybody in this room and doing everything that you do that's absolutely unrelated to this. When you think about the job that you do most of your day, and to have the awareness that this issue impacts virtually, if not every decision that you're going to make in that job, in the work that you do. And I think that that's what that training goes to. And that's why it's really important for people to be able to attend that, to be able to begin to understand that. So the biggest challenge is getting people to take 2 days out of their lives because no one really thinks they need this. And everybody has already gone through something like this before, so they've already done it. It's an awareness issue. And then it's people, because it's hard to go through this and not be more committed to this work than you were before. And then it is exactly the question that you're asking. Who is it that picks this up? Who is it that then says this is important enough for it to be something that I drive? And it is not the initiating institution. It's having enough people put their shoulder to this and make it part of what's happening in their lives. That's the challenge.
Courtney, you have another question from the audience? Yeah. Looks like a lot are coming in.
Yes. So Austin is a metro area. Many of the people working here don't necessarily live here. So how are you working to engage those surrounding communities on this issues like Georgetown, Manor, Pflugerville?
The initial initiative was Central Texas, or the Austin region. It was never just Austin, the city of Austin. So it's always, in fact, the working groups and the steering committee members came from all over the region, the community.
I'd also say that with the different groups, we had different representatives, and still here today. So I see my colleague Kelly, superintendent from Del Valle, is here. So it was very intentional. We set up we had the large group, but then we had, as Judy mentioned, we had the group on education and on criminal justice and the banking system and housing and so forth, and the other parts of health. Each one had then subcommittees. And so that's where we brought in different groups. And I know in ours, even when we looked at it, we didn't just look at K-12. We looked at higher ed. We looked at 4-year institutions and 2-year institutions. We looked at surrounding school districts. But every single one of our groups, and this is our colleagues also, KP and Ashton and Alba, who were also part of our group, we actually were very intentional about making sure that we met the expectations that Colette just mentioned, that it's not just the central core of Austin, it's really the Austin area, so that folks who live here, work here, or both are actually engaged in this, in the work that we were doing. And so that was very intentional about getting representation from not just Austin, but really throughout the Central Texas area.
So we've had a district system in place now for 4 years on the Austin City Council. This was supposed to allow for more equal representation, to give more parts of town a real voice on the dais. We've also hired the city's first chief equity officer to confront some of these institutional racism issues within, local government. How is the task force, I'm wondering, collaborating with the equity office to kind of evaluate Austin policies and practices that can lead to this institutional racism? Are you guys collaborating with the equity office? Is there some kind of synergy going on there?
Yes, the equity office and beyond. Mr. Oakes was intimately involved. I think he and I were in the same training together and had a conversation about when you're a person of color and you go through these trainings, you go into it thinking, what am I going to learn? Like, what are you going to tell me about race? And then you come out of it, on the other side of it, a different person, because you recognize your own biases. We all have it in the human. So that's a personal level between Mr. Oakes and I. So yes, we've had intimate ongoing. And I think there are several things, I can't speak to them specifically, that happened as a result of the task force conversations within the equity office. Mm-hmm. And even with other organizations, it's just changed the conversation about race. E3 Alliance, I went to an activity with E3 Alliance, and they had the recommendations from the task force on the board for people to talk about specifically. So there have been other organizations inside the city as well as outside the city that very specific, tangible things have happened.
So what about single-member districts? Has that structure, now that we've had it for 4 years, has that impacted policies, Mayor, around racial equity in our community? How do you see that impacting the city?
I think it's had an impact. I think it's had a huge impact, and I think that there are lots of things that have had an impact, and I think that what's happening right now in the city shows the cumulative impact of this initiative and the change in districts and so many other things. So we have a city council now, new council, 10-1 council, that has gone through a strategic planning process, which is the first time the city council has ever done that in our history. Hard to imagine if you actually run a business. It's actually setting priorities so that there are hard choices that are made as you go through a budgeting process and where you're going to spend your resources, because when you pick something, it means you're not picking something else, which is always the hardest thing for any kind of elected body to be able to do. But in terms of ultimate impact, the fact that this city has identified as its #1 priority homelessness, which is something that has a really disproportionate impact on populations of color in our city, and then identified housing, identified the issues where you see the greatest disparities between people on racial lines, I think is real indicative that we have a council and a city that is leaning into equity issues as the highest priorities in ways that we've never done before. And I think it's reflective of the change in structure, it's a change in institutions. It's also a growing realization that, again, that is the biggest threat to us. It is the biggest threat to Austin being able to survive with the spirit and culture of what makes the city special.
So you are prioritizing these racial inequities when you talk about budgets, because that's where the bottom line is. I mean, if we can't pay for these policies and practices, then they're not going to happen.
It's having it reflected in budget. You're absolutely right. It's the changes that we made with respect to arrest procedures and the disparity that you see with people who get tickets versus people who end up getting brought into our jails. It is again the filter to look at virtually, if not everything that we do.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Cruz, I know that you all in AISD are facing some really tough budgetary challenges right now that do disproportionately impact the communities of color. How can you make these issues a priority in your budget when you're already facing such tough times?
Certainly finances are always impacting school systems and public education, but I do think it's important when we look at it to make sure we're focused on the right areas, is look at our student data, look at performance, look at a multiplicity of student outcomes, not just standardized tests, using that, but looking at suspension rates, looking at attendance, looking at college readiness rates, continuing to invest in the programs that I do believe make a difference for our students, and understanding what those are. Programs that are now expanding in the Central Texas area, early college high schools, which we've started at Reagan and LBJ in the northeast area of the city, where we actually provide students an opportunity to earn college credit as freshmen, can actually earn an associate's degree and a high school diploma, and that's $20,000 value to the students and the families. And as we've talked about here, education is a game changer. So it's about looking at what's been done. Maybe it wasn't done since forever, but it's been done for the past 5 years. Let's continue to invest in that and prioritize it. There's really, I don't know that there's another way to do it. You have to look at student outcomes, a multiplicity of outcomes, and prioritize where those resources will benefit students most. I also think in this one, because as I mentioned earlier, there's no how-to in this one. So when teachers are in their classroom, or I'm visiting a school, or principals are principaling, it really is about self-awareness. And the mayor mentioned this too, it's about us changing us. It's not about somebody else changing something else. That's the hard part. You have to take a real hard look at yourself. So through Beyond Diversity training, we have, it's a large school system. So there's 130 campuses, a little under 12,000 employees, 6,000 of those are teachers. But it's actually then going through training. So we've had about 200, or will be trained, 200 individuals, school principals and individuals who are instructional leaders, to help us in their classrooms to see what it actually looks like in a classroom. What does it look like in a school? What are the policies and practices that are demonstrating positive gains for our students and those that are not? But it is taking even like something with this Beyond Diversity training, making sure that it's really, we're providing that to those people who are on the front line, so that they can see how they're reflecting on their practices and make those changes. That's what I think is When we look at investments, when we look at time spent, not just money, we have to see what's going to yield the best benefit, and this is much more self-awareness. That's why I think that training piece is so, so essential.
We've talked about people having a seat at the table. How are we going to ensure that the people most directly impacted by racial inequities, who sometimes don't have the ability to get downtown for a breakfast or go to a task force meeting, how are we making sure that they can participate and weigh in on where we go forward with this issue?
When we did the partnership with IBM, we intentionally tried to get people with lived experience, well, I'll take the word tryout, get people with lived experiences engaged in the conversation, because, and I'm going to mess this quote up, but Ayanna Pressley recently re-quoted it, the people closest to the pain need to be closest to the power. So when you're experiencing something, you need to be at the place of where decisions are made, closest to the power. So that is an underlying, that was an underlying goal of the task force from the very beginning, like the steering committee. It was more than just C-suite people. We engaged people that were activists, community activists, grassroots people. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't people that are sitting at the, in the C-suite, to use that term again, just talking about the problem without that lived experience. Even myself, I have a lived experience. So I can tend to get away from that as I elevate in my own career. So oftentimes you have to be reminded from whence we come. And that's where activism comes into play. I want to say something about resources and dollars. The power of this training is changing people's hearts. I say this a lot. There are two things that change people. There's broken hearts and open minds. And racism breaks people. It breaks their heart, it breaks their souls, etc. So we have to counteract that with something else, which is opening people's minds. So if you are a privileged person and you go through this training and you really open yourself up to it, it helps you to come into contact with your own innate biases. So then when you go and make decisions, when you decide who to vote for, when you decide what you want to be engaged in your life, what you decide to tolerate in your life, then you make more informed decisions that will actually then begin to de-institutionalize racism. So that's the power of the training. It's what happens in everyday lives. With the Women's Fund, there's some data in there that talks about child care. And there are vouchers that economically deprived or challenged people get as a voucher to be able to use for child care, to help them with child care. So if you have, and some of the institutional racism is that some of the more affluent centers don't accept those vouchers. So that's a dog whistle for, I don't want my child with poor kids. That's what that means. So if you take your child to a child care center and they in fact operate that way, you are a part of the problem, as opposed to using your voice to say, I don't want this to be happening in my life. So that's just one small example of how, and a training will make you attentive to that. And if you have not read the report, I encourage you to read the report, because it just gives you an insight as to what's really going on in Austin, to those of us that are not sitting in this room, like Judy said, those of us who cannot take off work or come downtown Austin to be engaged in this conversation. So, and if you don't want to read 70 pages because you don't have time, and I like to say that to remind ourselves that we do what's important to us, then read the section that's most important to you, be it education or health and wellness.
Mm-hmm.
So I would just say as a quick postscript on that, one of the unique things about the training that's taken place in Austin on this is we had training that was done entirely in Spanish. And we had the very first time that the people who have run this have actually run parallel sessions in Spanish and in English, two different groups, and then brought those groups together.
That's wonderful.
So there are unique efforts being made.
I think we have time for one more audience question, Courtney.
So across the 5 themes, how are outcomes being tracked to ensure the work being done is actually creating equitable outcomes? And also, where can people go to view this progress?
The first part of that question is, that's a part of the implementation plan. is to get those people with lived experiences and content experts together to come up with data and metrics on how to determine how we are successful. So that's the part we're in right now. So if someone has that kind of expertise, whoever submitted that question, we encourage you to get involved. As far as our progress, as far as our progress goes, that's one thing that we did not do well. Was we were so head down into the work that we did not communicate well what we were accomplishing, what we were doing. So people felt like I would meet people and they would say, well, what's happening with that task force? And then I would launch in to say everything that's happening and people just didn't know. So we have a communications plan where we're going to set up something that's very public. We already have a Facebook of course, that's, that's a cool thing now. So we have a Facebook site for institutional racism and systemic inequities. You can follow our progress on that. But we're going to come up with this part of this meeting on this Friday. So if you follow us in social media, you'll find out ways to be able to contact us and to get engaged. And I really, even if you don't think you want to be an ally, because you're all now, I hope, allies because you're coming, you hear about our progress. We really encourage you to want to be an accomplice, to get involved and to actually say, I want to be at the table so that I can be in the conversations to lend my expertise into that.
And I'll put in a quick plug on Decibel in March. We're going to be doing stories on all 5 of those areas to kind of track the progress and do some real life human experience. It's like, where are we with finance? Where are we with banking? So hopefully that will help keep the conversation going as well. I think it's probably time for our call to action. Well, actually, you have one more quick audience question? Yeah.
Sure. So we've been talking about training, beyond diversity training quite a bit, but when will part 2 of that be implemented where people can actually start creating action?
That's the same.
The same thing?
Yes. It's the same thing. The working groups reconvening. We have co-chairs for the working groups,
so to
right?
create that.
Right.
So it hasn't started yet.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But I'd also challenge a little bit what's inherent in the question, that the training isn't action in and of itself. Because quite frankly, if we could get 900,000 people in Central Texas to go through the training, everything else would take care of itself. Because there's an awareness issue. So we're not going to get to 900,000 people going through the training, so there's a lot more action work that has to be done. But just having people participate is in and of itself something which operates as a change agent in the city.
We didn't think that we would get 1,000 people to go through the training. So we're on an upward trajectory. We might not get to 900,000, but we should get to 899,000.
I commend Christopher and Leadership Austin for moving the work forward. I do. I think it's amazing because it was unexpected. But this is really, again, people stepping up saying, it's important to us, and it's so valuable, I need to let others know that I value it too as an individual and as an organization, and that's very powerful. But then it's how do we do that in our own organizations? If it's not this, what type of awareness and training is there? Because it's so much in the way we live and work every single day that there's a blind spot there. And so a lot of it is not necessarily a scorecard or an indicator. It is really the way we behave and the way we actually, the lens in which we look through our particular lens. If we had a 5-year-old right now come in and could actually do physics, we'd be pretty impressed. Probably some people in the room can do physics and no problem, and maybe some, maybe can't. But we'd be really impressed. If a student came into the room, a 5-year-old, and could speak only Spanish or Vietnamese or Mandarin, what do we say? Is that awesome, amazing, or do we say, yeah, you need to learn English? Now I'm saying, yes, we have to learn English. I'm not saying that. But there's something, a strength a 5-year-old brings that some people in this very room can't speak that language. But why do they need to change? Why not say, that's positive? That's what I mean by strength-based. Something very simple. Is that a policy issue? Well, probably. But it's also a behavior issue. What is it, our lens? How do we see that coming in as a strength or not? And when you have those situations, and when we look at these types of things that happen every single day, in the example that you also mentioned with the healthcare. Those are very simple things we just experience all the time. It's in a blind spot, it's implicit bias, it's how do we become self-aware. That's why the training and the information, how we socialize the information at the training. When I went through it, I thought the same thing. I mean, seriously, I'm an old dude, I've been through this a few times, right? But going through it, I was surprised. I've learned, but then also when I socialized information with the others around the table and with the larger group, it was very powerful, because now more individuals were talking about the very thing that we all feel is so important.
And this is going to segue well into our call to action, because you did a little bit of that just now, Dr. Cruz. I really want each of you on the panel, we'll start with you, Mayor, to give our audience here at the library and also those watching online something we can do as individuals to make Austin, to make our Central Texas community more racially equitable. I'll start with the mayor.
I think that it begins with awareness, and it's keeping this issue top of mind. It becomes the filter that we evaluate everything that we do. It becomes part of our priority base. So it's an awareness question, and right now in this community, this kind of training opportunity to be able to be in a room in a group of people that are going through this experience. And there are different kinds of these and different people that do them. So I'm not saying there's only one way or one path. But I would say that anybody that is within reach of this broadcast or watching this at home, I would say reach out to Leadership Austin or on the Facebook page, the community page, and say, how do I go through that program? How do I go through that training? How can I be part of that first step? Because there is a quantum difference between saying, I think this is important and it's something that I want to be involved in, and actually having invested time to really understand it and see it in ways that, quite frankly, if you haven't gone through it, you probably don't see the same way.
Or how can my employees go through this training if you're a business owner?
And it'll all be set up to be able to get that done. It'll be made easy.
Dr. Burnette, what is your call to action today?
That we commit to be change agents, that we commit to making Austin a place that's equitable and opportunity for all to have a good quality of life. Austin, I'm a military wife, and we've lived in lots of communities, and Austin is a rare community in that, just a very quick personal story. When I first got here, Ashton Cumberbatch asked me to join Austin Area Research Organization. And I went on the website and I looked at it, and it looked like a good old boy system. And I was like, I'm not going to join that, because my face doesn't look like that, so I'm not going to join that. But I got out of my comfort zone, and I joined the organization. And what I have found is that it's an organization of people that realize we're more alike than we are different, and committed. It may be an economic driver there to make Austin, the Austin area, prosperous for all. But the underlying goal there is people that have hearts to be change agents for the betterment of all people. So I encourage you to get out of your comfort zone, and it's what the mayor said in the beginning of the task force, to start being comfortable being uncomfortable, because that's where all the magic happens, outside of our comfort zone. So as long as we stay inside of our comfort zones, we won't see progress, so that we commit to be change agents.
Dr. Cruz.
Well, certainly agree with my colleagues, with Dr. Burnette and Mayor Adler, and what they said, because that really is a call to action. And it's learning, taking what our colleagues have shared right now and putting that into action. It is about going back to our workplace and thinking back through, when is the last time we actually talked about it in my work environment? Maybe that is what you do, maybe that isn't. Maybe it's something like, but that's way outside of our scope. But then, is it really, or is it not? So that's what I'd say is a call to action, is for everybody here to go back into your own workspace. Go in back with your family, with your kids, and have these types of conversations. When I had that with my children, it's always so informative that they're thinking about the same things. They're seeing the same things, But sometimes as a dad, I forget to ask them, or I think, man, they're really not seeing that, and guess they are. But having that conversation, moving that to the home environment with families, but also to the work family, and just reflecting, have we actually addressed it or have we not? Do we have indicators of where we're headed in these spaces or not? What is it really? And especially when I look around the room, there may be some areas that are just so much, we look at this all the time, but in some areas, probably not. And so let's just push ourselves, but take this conversation into that workspace and into the family space as well.
And before we close and thank our panelists, I want to highlight 2 major celebrations taking place in Austin this month. The first is January 21st from 9 to 3. It's the annual Martin Luther King March and Community Festival. It kicks off with the march at the UT campus and ends at the campus of Houston-Tillotson University, where a big festival is going to take place. And then on January 22nd, the next day from noon to 2, that's the National Day of Racial Healing. The Truth and Reconciliation Racial Healing Center, located at Austin Community College Highland Campus, is going to provide storytelling and performances. So just 2 of the many things that will be in our community, and we're going to follow up with an email with more information about those. Oh, Kazike, Prince, come on up.
Good morning, everyone. Not to take too much time, but I want to make sure you're aware of a few things. One, I want to thank Nikki Graham from Bank of America, Dexter Henderson from IBM, and Sandy Doshin, because those are the critical individuals who are involved with us working with IBM and their global headquarters on the design thinking. And what I mean by that, because it's a great example of how to get involved, and not kind of idly sitting by. One of the things they did, one is they had 7 of their staff members for free work with our team for 2 days through the design thinking process to help us prioritize our recommendations. But before that, he actually had their staff, which was about 8 or 9 people, go through the Beyond Diversity training themselves. So as they prepared the design thinking workshop, they had the common language with the people in the room to do the actual training. And that was money that they spent out of their budget for their team, and we didn't have to pay for the 2-day workshop that we went through. So that was in their investment of time, plus on top of that, they sat with us for 3 months ahead of time to help plan the actual workshop. So that's the kind of investment that they made, and it's the kind of example I want to give to you about how do I take this back to my organization, how do I get involved, how do I use my spheres of influence and relationships to stay involved and engaged. There is a Facebook group that you can be, if you want to learn the ongoing activities that's going on with the task force. I know if you're under 25, you're asking, why isn't this on Snapchat? But I don't know how to use that yet. So I'm working on it. I got a 20-year-old who's going to take me through a training, another training. And so that's definitely a way to get involved, to stay involved. But I would highly encourage you, if you haven't taken the training, you can. If you're concerned about the costs, it's something that Leadership Austin is taking leadership on to find funding to help people to not be as burdened with the cost. But this is another thing I want to introduce to you. We already have 60 individuals who are practitioners on the Courageous Conversations protocol. And those 60 individuals went through a 3-month training of several hours, I want to say 60 hours per person. But from that group of 60, we're actually going to have 30 individuals go through a 15-month training to actually offer the Courageous Conversations about Race training here locally. The reason being is that we need more individuals who are actually able to provide the training if we're even going to imagine getting close to 1 million people going through this training. And so if that's going to be the case, we need to have at least 30 individuals here. And so that's going to be a process that we're going to have them go through as well. So that's another way. And if you're wondering, hey, can I get involved? We've already kind of gone through that process. If you're interested in going through that kind of training, we can give you the information so you can find out how to do that. But I just want to make sure that you guys are aware of how to get involved, where to get information, but also give you an example of what that looks like. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kazike. And if you want to, once again, share the conversation via Facebook, the old geezer social media that, that many of us are familiar with, at Decibel ATX is our page. We've got this live. And I'll post it also on the page for the task force page. I want to say a deep bit of gratitude for Mayor Adler, Dr. Burnette, and Dr. Cruz for sharing their insight and expertise and all you do for the community. Thank you for being here today. Thank all of you for caring enough about this issue to spend an hour talking about it this morning, and I invite you all to come back to our Engaged Breakfast and make it a great day today.